Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the 22nd edition of WSDS, and we're starting with a very critical point of view, an understanding of what is happening in the world of climate change. And financing is something that the Prime Minister of India has focused on. It's very, very imperative. And here we have a wonderful set of speakers who will be discussing about private financing, the infrastructure part of it, and what is needed for us to reach net zero. We have a wonderful line of speakers, which will be moderated by Mr. Manish Chourasia, CEO and Managing Director of Tata Cleantech. There are partners for this session as well. So thank you so much for the entire team. Manish, sir, the floor is yours.
Very good morning, esteemed audience. Very warm welcome to all of you in this session on the financing India's ambition on net zero. We have a stellar panel today, and I think we have a very good opportunity for a very interactive session. Now, when it comes to the India's commitment, India has made an ambitious commitment to be net zero and by 2070. And this has to be seen in the context of the fact that India is likely to grow at the rate of 6 to 7% per annum for large number of years. And today, the way our systems work, it is based on emissions. So, each unit of GDP leads to emissions. So on one hand, we have current emissions, which is, I think, if I'm not wrong, around 3.5 gigatons per annum. And on the other hand, because we are likely to grow for so many years, in a natural course, these emissions can only go up unless our model of development itself changes. And we have made that commitment. So now clearly to meet that commitment, a lot of work needs to be done. We need a lot of work on the policy side. We need a lot of work on the technology side. We need a lot of work on the business models. But then the key enabler for all this is going to be financing. Now, when it comes to financing, it is very important to get the numbers right. So India started this journey a long time back. And starting from a very small base about a decade back. Today on renewable energy, we are at about 150 gigawatts, if we include large hydro. For this investment, for this 150 gigawatts, and for some progress which has happened on electric mobility, and to some extent on energy efficiency, the investments which have happened in the last 8 to 9 years is about $80 billion US. This may not be the exact figure, but exact figure will be close to this. Now we have to compare this against what needs to be done. So last year, 8 years, it is $80 billion US. And so this is a small group. So I would just request you to make a guess what that figure would be for the next 8 years. Any guesses on that? And you can make a very conservative estimate, no need to exaggerate. Okay, so $300 million. You mean $1 billion? 300 billion probably. Yeah, correct. Okay. Okay, good guess. Anyone else? Okay, fine. So, so you are way off, very honestly, because even with a very conservative estimate, the fund required by 2030 to meet the commitment which the country have made by 2030 is going to be $1.15 trillion US. This is our internal estimate in Tata Cleantech Capital, but this is very conservative. And this is not in thin air. This is for Cleantech. This is for Cleantech. And I'll just tell you the breakup of this. So, we start with renewable energy. So from 150 gigawatts reaching to 500 gigawatts is going to take at least $250 billion US. 250 to 300. You said 300. So this is only for the renewable energy. And then this renewable energy will need support of storage. If you pump too much of energy, renewable energy into the grid, you make the grid unstable. So that storage itself will be almost the same amount. Then we need investments in transmission. We need investments in distribution. We need investments in electric mobility. And if you add up all this, then easily we will reach $1 trillion and more. So now $1 trillion in isolation, gives you some context, but not a great context. So I'll give you some comparisons. Today, the banking asset book in India, the banking asset book is around 2.3 to 2.4 trillion. So this 1.15 trillion is almost 50% of that. And if you take the credit is around 1.6 trillion. So this is, almost 70% of that amount. So clearly, to have this kind of investments, we need to ensure that all cylinders fire. Clearly, we need domestic savings, but all domestic savings cannot just go to this sector. So international capital flows will be very important. But then international capital flows are not simple. Money only comes where there's a business case, where there's a basic viability. And when we talk about international capital flows, there is competition. And those flows come with their own risk. Today, sometimes the individual borrowers feel very happy that they've been able to raise money from some, say, multilateral institution at 1%. But what happens is that at the end of a few years, they realize that 1% could have been anything, 12%, 13%. What I'm referring is to the currency risk. So how do we hedge this currency? Today, the unfortunate reality is that hedging risk is being taken by the borrowers who don't have the capability to do this, who don't have any skill set to do this. And if we are talking about trillions of dollars coming in, it will come with their own risk. How do we mitigate this risk? It is not just about the quantum of financing. If we talk about the clean tech sector, if it has to be viable, and if there has to be a business case, the cost is also important. The tenor of that funding is also important. So when it comes to cost, the importance can be seen from the fact that most of the technologies which are there on renewable or storage, all those costs are upfront. And actually, the variable cost is very low in all these technologies. So it is the cost of capital which is the key cost. And if we are able to reduce that cost of capital, then there would be a business case for these technologies, and then they can grow exponentially. So how do we ensure that apart from the quantum, we also reduce the cost of capital? And then most of these technologies are such that returns come over only a very long period of time and on firm contracts. So how do we ensure that, the financing which is happening is for longer tenures? Today, when the financing happens, it happens for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And it also happens on the floating rate loans, which are very risky because, then you really don't know the cost of that capital. So how can these issues be addressed? I think to discuss all this and much more, we have got a very stellar panel with us. And, I would be very happy if we have a very interactive discussions. So we have with us Mr. Peter Mandry. Just one second. Sorry for the interruption. Mr. Peter Mandry is Associate Data Analyst and Data Modeling from Green Climate Fund. Welcome, Mr. Peter. We have Mr. Virendra Pankaj. He is CEO, Asim Infrastructure Finance Limited. So he's from a domestic financial institution. He'll give us a good perspective there. Then we have Mr. Shalabh Tandon, Regional Head of Operations in South Asia, Head of Climate Business, International Finance Corporation. So we will hear from him and get some perspective on the multilateral financing. And we have Mr. Manikkan Sangameswaran, Executive Director and CEO, Radiance Renewables. So Manikkan is from the industry itself. So we will probably get a very good perspective on how the industry is seeing at the financing. So very warm welcome to all of you. And I would first request each of the panelists to give introductory remarks, starting from Mr. Manikkan. Over to you.
Thank you, Manish, for that kind introduction. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, sorry. No, thanks, Manish, for the kind words of introduction. I think the biggest challenge the world has faced recently was the COVID challenge. And the next big challenge that we are all facing is the climate change challenge. And this is an area where we at Radiance Renewables are committed to towards decarbonization. And that's also what our shareholders, who are basically Green Growth Equity Fund, is focused on. So there are multiple areas in which we are doing it. And I think, as Manish rightly pointed out, in any infrastructure project, for making this happen, 70 to 75% is coming from debt, and 25% to 30% is coming from equity. And you can have all the technology in the world, you can have all the business models in the world, but if there is no financing, there's no business on the ground. So I think it's very, very important. This session is extremely important from the way I see it, because this is going to determine the way in which the business gets built in India. And I think India has a very good chance of taking on leadership, which it has demonstrated by delivering this kind of capacity in a very short period of time. And I think there is a real revolution and movement happening in India right now, and the developers are completely committed to this delivery. And I think the good thing is that if we sort out the financing with the help of multilateral institutions and other investors, the markets, and the savings that we talked about, there is a real opportunity for us to get this going and have achieved this number, what we're talking about by 2030 or by 2070, the numbers that we're talking about. It's not impossible to achieve, but it requires a very concerted effort. So, from our perspective, we are actually geared up for the growth. We ourselves have grown from a 0 megawatt in 2019-20 to now we are closing at a 425 megawatt in 3 years, out of which 2 years were in COVID. So we built a lot of capacity during COVID as well. So, and we built up the whole team during that time. So there are many such developers who are working on it. And my concerns really, Manish, is that as we embark on this journey together in this country, I see that if the sector becomes sector limits are sector exposure limits are reached by the banks and institutions, which may not happen immediately, but at some point, that's my concern, that the numbers that we are talking about are very large, running into trillions of dollars. And that might be the real concern that we should start thinking about now, because you can't think about it 5-7 years down the road. And that's a real concern. I think, therefore, the market mechanisms have to start building. The bond markets have to be more energized than where we are today. I think there's a lot of action happening there as well, but it hasn't reached that particular point. So those are my initial comments, Manish.
Opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Manish. As most of you would know, IFC is part of the World Bank Group, and we do business in many emerging markets. India is our largest exposure worldwide, and every year we are now trying to do about $20 to $25 billion of business in emerging markets, both debt and equity. But even that is so small in comparison to the requirements that Manish mentioned. So what should be the role of multilaterals? And I think it's key that we use our capital judiciously, and we give a signal to international investors that a particular sector in a particular country is ripe for international financing. And that comes when we finance any project in any emerging market. Climate change is a big part of our strategy. So whenever we finance a project, we try and mobilize capital from as many diversified sources as possible. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not possible, but we do that through our stamp of approval and approaching our big community of international investors who get the confidence that because IFC has looked at a project in a particular country, all the risks are somehow covered. But even then, the requirement is huge. And as you were rightly saying, development of capital markets holds the key, especially for countries like India, where markets are reasonably mature, but they have to take the next big leap. And we can discuss more of that later. Currency risk is obviously another big challenge. Large infrastructure projects require really long-term funding. For years, multilaterals have been one of their strengths because of their AAA rating and because of the way our shareholder and capital structure is set up, are geared to provide really long-term funding, sometimes in local currency and fixed rate also. So that takes away the floating rate risks. But how do we incentivize the larger international community to take those risks? And there, I think One of the ways we can do it is to look at operating assets. Some of the models exist in India, like InvIT structures and so on. But in many countries, once the construction risk is over, free up the capital of the banking industry to do more and more greenfield and get international capital in more yield platforms where the construction risk is over, the risks are lowered, and you can then palm off your capital to them and use your capital to do more greenfield. And there are many structures in play that's a role we want to actively play. We are playing in certain countries and so on. And we have also developed what are called co-mobilization facilities in many countries where we have formed a consortium of international banks for climate change projects where $1 of IFC that we put into any project automatically gets subscription from an international set of lenders based on pre-agreed terms and conditions, the templated terms. And I think that's the standardization direction the world has to move to, because every time you look at a project you take to a lender and you take 9 months to convince a lender in a project finance basis, that's not going to work easily. If you have to do $1 trillion by 2030 and so on. So there has to be standardization. There has to be some templates in place. There has to be standardization on lowering the risk so that once the project is appraised, automatic money flows in for a certain risk parameter. Let me stop here. We can discuss more during the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Shalabh.
Good morning. I think let me start from the other end, which is ground end or micro end, as we call it. While the amount is large, and I remember because at that time also we were engaged when India first announced its solar ambitions. Everybody, including us, thought, this is not going to happen. It's too much. And same questions: where will the money come from? Yeah. There's hardly any long-term project financing happening in India. Who will do it? But truth is that last 10 years, India has reached where it has reached in solar. I think it's humongous. 10 years back in a similar room, probably nobody would have believed that it's possible. So it happened. Yeah. And if I were to oversimplify why it happened, I'll simply say that because it worked. It's very important for Indian stakeholders कि पड़ता खाना चाहिए. It should be viable for everybody: consumer, developer, lender, equity investor, discom. For everybody, it should make commercial sense. And it did make commercial sense. I mean, the route we followed initially, there was subsidy, all that is well known. But so one thing is very clear, that we need to focus on making it work commercially, economically, and from risk perspective. Maybe somewhere down the line we'll talk specifically about risk. If we do that and make it viable, I think it's possible. We may not reach 1.5 trillion, just like probably we were delayed by a year or two in our previous targets. We are late by 2-3 years, but yes, we have made multifold progress. So if not $1.5 trillion, $800 billion is still 10x of where we are today. So it may happen. In terms of sources, which is again linked to things working. If things work, like I still remember, for the first time when we sold a solar paper to a mutual fund, it took us about 6 months to convince them. Because they were not used to that kind of tenors or that kind of structures. Where there is no security. Road belongs to the state and you have nothing. So these things take time, but then once they understand, it works. A very simple, easy, low-hanging fruit one could look at, like today in India's infrastructure space, you see a very large presence of global pension funds. There are Canadians, there is Abu Dhabi, there is Singapore, there is Australia, there is US. Now, our EPFO is not a small provident fund. If you look at it globally, we are like Last year, about $220 billion, maybe, at 10%. So let's say $250 billion corpus, which is huge corpus. And how much of that would have come in? I think very, very, I mean, we don't see them, right, owning infra assets, just as we see Canadians and Australians and others doing that in India. So I think the challenge for us lies in tying in the pools of capital, which means, provident fund pool, mutual fund pool, banking pool, insurance, IRDA, so problem is we have been, we tend to look in silos. Each sector has its own regulator, which tends to think in their narrow confine, and maybe one missing piece, which, could work, is that a lot of these people lost capital in the previous decade. That is, I'm talking about, let's say 2000 to 2010 decade in infrastructure financing. On equity side and debt side, people lost capital. Various reasons to go into that. So now they are not specialist infrastructure finance, investors, our provident fund or our insurance companies. So the role perhaps for company like ours and Tata Cleantech, and maybe, let's say half a dozen specialist infrastructure financing institutions, is to pave the way, as Shalabh said, standardization, templatization, appraising, monitoring, which every investor cannot. Tomorrow, Public of India, I have not touched upon. It's a huge source of capital. But then if we bring in Public of India into infrastructure financing, we have to make sure that their capital is protected. That will require, risk structuring, and that will require specialist players to monitor that investment. Because it's not every banks do everything. I mean, they do a farmer loan, they also do a aircraft loan, they also do infra. But, you and I only do that. And maybe another half a dozen people in India, half a dozen institutions, maybe there'll be a dozen going forward. But that, if we can introduce somewhere a layer of specialists in between, and which does the standardization, which has that credibility, that, their term sheet, their appraisal has a belief in the market that this will work, and, some support structure coming in, and all of them working together. I think SEBI, RBI, IRDA, PFRDA, we and stakeholders, we need to lock ourselves into a room and not come out till we come out with a common, template on how to do it. And I think that it's possible. Thank you.
So thank you. I'll now request Peter to give his introductory comments.
Should I go to presentation?
It's okay. You can give the presentation.
Thank you, Manish. It's pleasure to be here with you all. Coming to discuss and learning from independent evaluation units of the Green Climate Fund. Just to start, maybe I should start to introduce what is Green Climate Fund, because all of panelists we are discussing about the financing gap that we are facing here. And the Green Climate Fund was established in 2010 to support developing countries dealing with the challenge of climate change. And it just work to promote a paradigm shift towards low carbon emission and climate resilient pathways. And it's doing this by the principle of country ownership. And here we mean that the developing countries are leading the programming of the GCF as well as implementation side. And to date, the GCF has approved USD 11.4 billion. And just to the good side, India is leading that initiatives. If you look at the the left side, the panel, you can see the number of projects that have been approved so far and volume of finance. And you can see the India is on top of that. So that's a great, and 86% of that is on mitigation, and adaptation is 14%. So after that, that's all about the Green Climate Fund. Now I will move to Independent Evaluation Unit. So Independent Evaluation Unit is the accountability and learning arm of the Green Climate Fund, where we look and see whether the GCF is doing right things or is doing things right. So we are looking at effectiveness and efficiency here. And today I will just focus on the two evaluation that we have conducted last year, looking at the evaluation of GCF approach to private sector, as well as adaptation. And the big question that we have in room, so the Indian NDCs have a financial need of 2.5 trillion. I had a lot of 1.5. I had 1 trillion. So I think there are different numbers, but what I saw from the NDC is 2.5 trillion. And that is approximate to 170 million per year. So that is enormous amount of money that is needed. And to do so, I think the public finance or MDBs and other FIs cannot do alone. We need to have a private sector on the table. We need to have other partners that we can sit on the table to discuss and to see what we can improve to have this finance. So to look at the GCF function, we see that there is a critical need for a GCF to focus on enabling environment for private sector mobilization. And here we look at the policy and regulatory reforms. We have had a lot of presenters and panelists before they talk about that one. So looking at the market mechanism within the countries, and also building the capacity of local financial institutions that they can deal and create these bankable environments that are viable and can be financed. And also providing technical assistance at different project stage or project life cycle. And here we are looking also at the blended finance or flexible financial financing structure, where we can combine more than one instrument based on the what is the level of technology. Is that technology already in the market? So a good example we can think of, maybe renewable energy is already like matured in the market, mature technology. So what instrument the GCF can provide there in order to facilitate or to enable private sector and other actors to jump in and provide additional dollars so that we can reach this financing amount of finance that we need. So at that point, we say maybe loan or equity could be nice for a GCF to provide to countries. And if the market is not established at all, it's very, very beginning at piloting stage, it's new technology, very high risk. So at that point of time, we think the GCF have a good position to provide grants and technical assistance to local financial institution, MSMEs, and others in order to make that that project viable. Also, when we look at the adaptation, we even had in the morning discussion about the financial need for adaptation. And in the governing instrument of Green Climate Fund, is all about maximizing the impact of its funds, looking at both mitigation and adaptation, but also able to balance these two, because both are important for the countries. And most of the developing countries see its LDCs are more into adaptation than mitigation. And however, looking at the adaptation portfolio, we see that the GCF has so far approved only 38% of its finance, just supporting the adaptation. And that means adaptation is lagging behind in its financing. And we conclude by saying that the adaptation, the GCF is uniquely positioned to be in a better position to create a good environment for adaptation for countries to deal with these high risk projects or creating some policies that are consistent with the country needs and also with the within the NDCs. But also we can look at the comparative advantage of the Green Climate Fund, looking at the total finance flows to non-OECD countries or GCF eligible countries. So we are looking at all non-Annex 1 countries and total finance that they put down in their NDCs. And this data from climate policy initiatives says that the total finance that is required for mitigation is 586 billion per year. And for mitigation, for adaptation is 49 billion per year. And if we look at the GCF work, it can approve or it can just support only 3.9 billion per year in mitigation and 1.4 billion per year in adaptation. So if we look at the relative scale between what is required and what is provided, we see that the GCF is really minor actor here, but it has opportunity to be more relevant for adaptation than mitigation. Because you look, the market share for mitigation is less than 1%, but market share for adaptation is 3%. So that's meaningful and can be used for the GCF can use that to fill financial gaps that is there, as well as reducing risks by using all range of its financial instruments and supporting the development of new markets within the countries. Last but not least, we say that we measure what we treasure. So this is very important for the GCF to create framework. We heard about framework a lot that will enable to measure or to see what's the progress towards attaining the objectives that we are talking about. So the GCF, the framework that it has is not really useful tool to measure and look at the private sector contribution, and it doesn't so far contribute or include national systems. Each country have national systems. If you want to work well, you need to incorporate, to be inclusive with the national systems. And also we conduct the availability study where we look at the quality at entry and looking at how funding proposals provide their theory of change, logical pathways, including implementation fidelity, as well as M&E budget. And this M&E budget is crucial at the beginning to be included, and the GCF need to chip in to provide this finance. But we see that the private sector are not, well, the other side are not really good in putting this framework and or put everything in plan just to deal with the and impacts that we want to see at a social impact. And also the other challenge is on transparent and availability of data and information from private sector. And here we recommend also to have a clear policies within the countries and also at the GCF level that will enable that transparency and availability of information, what is happening within the private sector and what we are dealing with. So that's it from my side, and I'm really happy to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That was very comprehensive information on GCF, and we'll have a few follow-up questions, which we'll cover later. So I have some questions for Virendra to start with. So Virendra, you have been in this business of funding climate projects. And as we discussed, the cost of funding is crucial. And funding is nothing but a risk-free rate plus risk premium. So what can be done to reduce this risk premium? What are the key steps we need to take? And I believe that once that is done, then you spoke about the capital market. That also probably will get more attracted towards this. So I would like to know your views on that.
Completely agree, Manish. I think one thing we need to understand that globally, availability of capital is inversely proportional to risk. So low risk markets attract many more times capital than high risk markets. People invest in high risk market because they want higher returns, but they don't typically, nobody will put in, you will also not put in maybe more than 10% of your savings into a high risk, high reward kind of a situation. That's what the whole world does. So today when we speak, each country, whether every investor, let's assume for a moment, global investor, when they invest in India, whether it's equity or debt, it doesn't matter. What they do is they start with a base rate, just like in India, you have GSEC, let's say US Fed, right? So that's the AAA which is available to them. And then they add what they call as India risk to that. Now, India risk has two parts. One part, as you rightly mentioned, is the Forex risk. Because if you see last, whatever, 10, 20, 30 years, our currency has been depreciating on an average 3 to 5% every year. So Forex risk, they add a premium. And then this so-called India risk, unfortunately, is nothing but risk of, let's say, unknowns happening, uncertainties not planned for earlier coming in the way. Again, on positive side, last 10 years, this has shrunk. When we were doing our first solar project, we were charging maybe what, 13% per annum interest. Today, we do the same transaction at 9%. So why this 400 bips cost of capital has come down? Because we have experienced in last 10 years that if done right, this works and the credit costs are low. When equity started coming into solar sector in India in 2011-12, their minimum hurdle rate used to be 20 to 24%, which includes Forex risk, India risk, all those risks put together. Today, if you work backward from the bidding that is happening, I think it would be somewhere around 12, realistically speaking, or 12 or 13. So that has also shrunk. But we need to shrink it, far more, because one is the cost of capital, another is amount of capital. More you shrink this risk premium, more capital becomes available to India, and the same answers for public, same answers for mutual funds, same answers for insurance, everybody. Nobody wants to put the, pension money of their investors at risk. They cannot. So capital protection one way or another, which ultimately all these things translates into, reduction of risk in the systems. And that is where, sanctity of a contract, continuity. Luckily, India has had continuity of policy now. Last decade, we have had a continuity of support, for wind energy, for example, is very visible and very consistent. So obviously, that is one of the things. Now, these things, policy continuity, consistency, contract honoring, and equitable risk sharing, which, in road sector, for example, NHAI did after a lot of trial and errors, they finally came out with models which were, somewhere NHAI was also absorbing the risk, and that has led to risk reduction and more capital coming. So I think so the model is known to us, frankly. We have done it in a few sectors. We just need to make it, templatize and use it across, rather than trying to reinvent. If we are now talking about railways, so there's no need to come out with new models. We have successful models. You should have a good regulator. You should have a good coordinating agency like SECI. Ministry should be proactive like MNRE, and this will work.
Very pertinent points, Viren. Enforceability of contracts, then consistency in policies, and then central agencies like SECI. All this can make a huge difference and reduce the risk premium. And as you said, actually, unfortunately, it's inverse. The lower the risk, more the capital. So thank you so much for your comments. Now we talk about capital market, and Viren spoke about the fact that we also have big funds in India. Provident Fund itself is so big. And why can't they become a provider of capital? So I would like to go to Shalabh and take his views on, how can we actually ensure that our capital market is more receptive to green financing, And what is the role that multilaterals can play on this? So actually, I'm asking you two questions. Over to you, Shalabh.
Thanks, Manish. So, as has been pointed out, there is ultimately for the long-term sustainable finance in this field, you have to have domestic sources of financing. You have to have local capital markets development. That goes without saying. There is you can always do swap, hedging, and all that, but those are all temporary measures. For the long-term financing, you need the savings to be channelized, whether insurance companies, provident fund, whatever. So I don't need to make that argument. Let me touch upon what role multilaterals can play and also briefly what track record we have so far in the capital markets arena. So first of all, IFC and a few other multilaterals are members of ICMA, which is the International Capital Market Association. So we have been involved in, for example, more recently formulating the policies and guidelines and principles around green bonds, blue bonds, more recently around the entire transition finance framework, which talks about sustainability linked bonds and how would green transition finance work. So IFC is a central member of that ICMA, which frames these rules. So we are in a position to really advise governments and regulators how to open up capital market. Second, we have two vibrant programs that we do actively to advise regulators, governments, issuers, and also attract investors for capital market. One program is called the Joint Capital Market JCAP program of the World Bank Group, IFC and World Bank, which is active in about 8 countries and 1 region. Not so much in India because India is fairly advanced. Maybe the scale and the pricing needs to be reduced, but there are many other markets, including Nepal, Vietnam, other smaller countries where this needs to be educated. But for countries like India, we have also a program called the Sustainable Banking Finance Network, SBFN. What we do is IFC convenes, and there are more than 60 members in that, which are central banks of other countries, which are banking associations of other countries, and we share best practices and lessons of experience there. We calibrate each country where they are in their journey of attracting capital market solutions for their financing. And there could be something which may apply to India, something which India can advise and may apply to Nepal and Bangladesh and also. That's a vibrant group that we do. The RBI in India is a member of NGFS, which is the network of central banks for greening the financial systems. And IFC is an observer there. That's another forum which is doing it. So all I can say is the multilaterals are in a unique position, having seen this in many different markets, developed as well as developing, to customize and tailor and give the advice to the local central banks as to what might work within their demographics or peculiarities and so on. And that's a role which we want to continue to actively play. And second is on actual role when actually a bond comes out. And IFC often becomes a anchor investor in all these bond issuances to signal international capital to come in. Very recently in India, we were an anchor investor to Continuum, which is pretty similar to what you do. And they did a green bond in Singapore market, which was oversubscribed by many times. And that's a success of IFC coming in as an anchor investor. Similarly, we did a sustainability linked bond for a company called Semcob in East Asia, which had a lot of coal assets and renewable, and we had benchmarks around it. Similarly for Enel, which is a global player. So we can play anchor investor role, which mobilizes international capital. On hedging, I think the way you can hedge is only through swap counterparties. And we believe in ultimately long-term, there has to be a credible swap counterparty and the market forces to take over. If you want cheap swaps and hedging, that's only temporary measures till your capital markets develop. So you can always do those solutions in the interim to get some financing, but ultimately there is no substitute for a vibrant capital markets to finance at scale and which is sustainable. Thanks.
Thanks, Shalabh. I think all very pertinent comments. I do believe that multilaterals have played a very important role. Forums like ICMA, SBFN are important because you have experience of so many geographies. So this interoperability is something which multilaterals can do very effectively. And playing a role of an anchor investor also makes a huge difference when you have skin in the game. On hedging, yes, we need a improvement in the capital markets. So these are all very important points. Thank you so much for this. I will now go to Mr. Manikkan. So, you deal with the Indian banking system, and at some stage, you'll also have aspiration to go to the capital markets.
Yes.
Today, when you deal with the Indian banking system, so you spoke about the fact that your concern is about the group limits. But what are the other practical challenges you face?
Okay.
And what is the room for improvement there?
So I think I'd like to distinguish that question slightly differently.
Okay.
And because we are a very focused C&I player.
Yep.
And unlike many of other players who supply power to utility companies and largely participating in SECI bids or GUVNL bids and NTPC bids. So they have a very different profile when they go to the banking community. We have always had this charter that we will be focusing on the corporate, industrial, commercial segment, because that's a segment that did not have too many takers at that time when we started off to support. So our experience has been pretty interesting in the last 3 years that we have built this business. So initially we did a lot of rooftop projects, and I think SBI had a good line with the World Bank, and I think Tata Cleantech also, you guys were very supportive because of the line that you have with GCF. And those were good projects that we have partnered with. And in fact, I must say that Tata Cleantech is one of the few companies who was actually financing in the C&I market, and there weren't too many takers. I think the issue was largely to do with institutional understanding and risk understanding, the point that was mentioned earlier about the C&I marketplace. I think the general capital flows were also going in largely into the utility sector, because the understanding is that the counterparty is SECI, which is a robust entity, and therefore the risks are low. And from a pension fund perspective and the global investors, they see that as a stronger counterparty. But we always believe that ultimately a good corporate AA, AAA rated customer who's a counterparty and who has a strong contract with you, and the point that Viren mentioned about, at the end of the day, if the counterparty is strong and there is an economic saving, what you made it work, ultimately the business model has to be strong. And we found that if the business model is strong, you can actually convince the banks and institutions. They take a little bit longer time, but they do come in. So what we see the market is there are two kinds of lending market, the way we see it from an industry perspective. That's where I think you guys have a good advantage. One is the banking market in general, which is largely the public sector banks. Their ability to assess a project and sort of participate is pretty long in terms of sanctioning and disbursing. Whereas that's where an NBFC like you come into play and are able to do things better and faster, because the institutional knowledge and understanding is far superior. It's not to say that the project financing is not understood by the sort of the banks, but there are pockets where there is a strength and there are pockets where there is they don't have a clear understanding, and they take longer time. And also the size becomes an issue for them. And mostly if you see the market that we are operating in the C&I space, our projects can vary from say 5 megawatt to a 200 megawatt, depending on the customer requirement, because we are operating in that space and every project is a separate project. So the size of debt that we need for the project is a function of the capacity that we're putting up for the customer. In which case, what we have cracked is that it makes most sense to bundle projects together, pool them together, and offer as a larger size ticket to even an NBFC or to a bank. And that model seems to be working because the ticket size is worth the effort for them to spend time and effort. And the other point I want to add is that initially the C&I market was having a lot more challenges in terms of financing, but that is changing now. We see that there's a lot more interest coming in, even from long-term capital and pension funds, to take exposure to C&I market. This has resulted in two things. Some players who are purely utility focused are also sort of putting a little bit more capital into the C&I market, doing a strategy drift and trying to sweeten their portfolio in terms of return. And there are other people who are doing more C&I business have also gone into the utility because they're getting more capital into that space. So this is happening both ways. But I think the areas where I see this will change going forward because the market is building. It's still a small market, 2 to 3 gigawatt market compared to the larger market of 30 gigawatts that we're talking about on a per annum basis for the utility sector. So it's like 10% of the size. So in terms of exposure for the banks and institutions, they should have the headroom, they should have the ability. And from their perspective, they're always getting a slightly better rate in the C&I market than they would get in the sort of utility segment. So we think that there is a good improvement that we are seeing, and we think this is going to further improve going forward. And I think later on, I think we will see InvITs coming in the C&I market as well. We don't see that happening yet. But infra funds are willing to now start taking a bet on the C&I sector as well. So those are some green shoots that we see in terms of the financing challenges being eased for us. But at the end of the day, as a developer, we want to recycle our capital, and we want to recycle the capital as much as we can do. Otherwise, we have to keep on raising capital to do more business. So those are some of my comments, Shalabh, on that. Unless you have something more specific to us.
I think, very interesting perspective. Clearly, one thing is clear from what you're telling, and this is coming from a practitioner, that CNI market is now getting mainstream, which is the good news. There will be new segments in clean tech, and eventually it is important for them to get mainstream. That is number one. And number two, my takeaway is that NBFC and banks are playing a complementary role. So this is.
I would add, Manish, one more comment is that in the CNI market, the gestation period or the construction period of the project are pretty short, right? We normally complete a project within 6 months.
Yeah.
If you got the land and your evacuation sorted out, it's 5 to 6 months for a project of a size of 50 megawatt AC. And for that, typically what works for us is a good construction financing line.
Yeah.
Because to get the financial closure done takes around 3 to 4 months, and the project has to move forward. And I think that's where I think there's a good opportunity for a lot of NBFCs to be faster and quicker and deliver. I think we've done that with you guys. We've done with PTC Financial Services. They've been very nimble in terms of moving forward, and we find that that's a good market space where the banks are not able to move as fast, and that's really a big opportunity for the returns that NBFC is looking for compared to the banks, and that's a niche segment that can accelerate the build out in the market.
Thank you. Thanks, Mani, for those things. I now come to Peter. So Peter, very nice presentation, and you spoke about the wonderful work done being GCF on mitigation, on adaptation. Now, when it comes to mitigation, it is not just about developing a project. If we have to do this at scale, then even creating a manufacturing ecosystem is important. So my question to you is that something which is being considered by GCF? And if yes, then what are your plans? Just to add to my point, today, most of this manufacturing is confined to very few countries, and that is kind of creating an imbalance. So how can this be addressed, and what can be the role of GCF in this?
So I think I will just try to answer your question in a very, very broad way, because as I said before, that the GCF is responding to country needs, and countries are the one who program, and they're the one who implement and work hand in hand with the GCF all the way. And the GCF is work with a different range of partners. We call them accredited entities. And so in terms of manufacturing, that's the country need to identify and to put some project ideas and all concept notes in place. But there is a big challenge here. From when the concept note is identified, the communication between countries and the GCF to when the projects come to be approved and get that dollar and start implementation is very, very long. And we identify a lot of hurdles and difficulties that the countries and partners are facing, including so the GCF have this criteria of climate rationale. So I think ICF and all banks know about the climate rationale, that if you have to identify or to say this project is going to help or overall just to justify the climate rationale behind the project, not only come up with or developing a project, but it should be climate change related. So with that, the GCF is trying to leverage traditional knowledge and all other best practices that are used at the country level to see how they can use that information to scale up. Because the issue here is scaling up the projects and intervention within the countries. An example I can just look at the big projects that have been done in Mauritius, and this was a renewable energy. The GCF supports from the beginning with the technical support, technical assistance, and they put solar panels, and now it just gone phase by phase. Phase 1, technical support. Phase 2, looking at the instruments, computers and others, panels, installment. And phase 3, we are looking at the storage, because a renewable energy itself, yes, you can have panels and everything, but you have to think about storage. So storage is a challenge as well, and the technology is still into development. But also not only storage, but transmission. There is transmission cost as well as supply. That's what is produced and what is financed. It goes to support at the end to the end user consumers. So that's what I can talk. But there are a lot of opportunities that the GCF is providing, not only at the main project, but also it has this what we call readiness support. So this is a small grant that is provided for every country, either to put the strategies, to prepare the policies in place that they can somehow strategically work with the GCF. So there is a readiness, and also there is a national adaptation plans, where it just provide to every country up to 3 million to develop their national strategies in adaptation, national adaptation and mitigation plans. And also after that plans, you put some concept notes. So if you identify the energy sector or transport sector is an issue, you have to put a concept note. And then you go to the next phase where they provide a project preparation facility to do all the feasibility studies, to do data collection, to identify what are the risks that we are expecting in this project, and how to mitigate, or how to put a plan and measures in place to mitigate those risks. So that facility also is provided by GCF. Then move on to other different windows, that's including maybe simplified approval process, or mobilizing fund at scale, where you come with the concept notes and the GCF is assessing and look through that if it's viable, and if it's aligned with the national determined contribution, and also it's aligned with the GCF investment criteria, then move forward to financing. So in a nutshell, there are a lot of opportunities. I cannot just only stick to manufacturing because there is like renewable, there is low emission transport, building cities and appliances, and forest and land use. So the broad range of support that GCF can provide, but this should align with the national NDCs and national determined contributions, and also it's aligned with the national policies.
So as long as the investment is aligned with NDC, GCF has this wonderful facility, which is a grant of 3 million. And through that, one can always work and find out what are the requirements of the country and come to GCF. Thank you so much. I think GCF is playing a great role. I will continue to do that. Shalabh, coming to you, you spoke about the hedging and the importance of vibrant capital market for hedging. And it's a big market today. It's a market of, if I'm not wrong, $6 trillion. But then this market is confined to very few currencies, G10 currencies, developing world currency, maybe not even 1 or 2% of that market. So market is important, but how do we ensure that that market develops? What kind of support development financial institutions can give to this market, so that this market develops and the market takes care of the hedging instead of it being reliant on subsidies? We would like to hear your opinion.
Well, that's a very relevant question. I think it is probably best answered through some examples. So IFC has local currency products in more than 60 countries. When I say local currency product, we give loan in the currency of that country to our client. And how do we normally do that? So we do that by swapping it with a market entity if it exists. And if it doesn't exist, we go to the central bank and say, we'll swap with you. So central bank is the repository of everything. And then we start by saying, okay, let's start with the central bank. We'll swap with you. We'll start the process of hedging. Slowly, banks will get interested in this, foreign banks and so on, and the word gets out more and more. After doing 5 transactions, 10 transactions, 20 transactions, slowly the market starts developing, and you see commercial banks entering into the place and so on. Let me give you examples of difficult countries. Like on one end is like Nepal, where IFC with its AAA entity may not even swap with the central bank. So we swap with an entity called TCX, the currency exchange fund, which is owned by a number of bilaterals and multilaterals. It's an offshore swap dealer, particularly designed to help you hedge in local currency in a market which is illiquid. Either illiquid or the market doesn't exist or it's not deep for long tenors. So you at least make a beginning and start with that. And then parallelly, you work on the process of advising the regulators and central bank to open up domestic pools of capital in a calibrated manner so that the swap market develops. And that's essentially what happened even in India. We gave our first local currency loan to our client way back in 2000. But today, it's a lot of clients can hedge on their own and so on. Maybe not long term to the extent that they require. There, multilaterals can play a role by giving some partial credit guarantees or credit enhancement or first loss guarantees so that you can stretch the tenor of the loan that you want to hedge and swap. We have also, in many regulations, including in India, we have also made a plea to the central banks or equivalent reserve banks in various countries that even if we don't hedge, we don't give our own loan, allow us to hedge the loans given by other foreign banks to an infrastructure project in a particular country. So let's say you take a loan from, say, Standard Chartered, this bank, or maybe another a pension fund, whatever, foreign pension fund, and you want to hedge it, and your pricing is high. Can IFC come in and do an overlay non-deliverable swap for you? We can do it. We are willing for development and for climate to put our AAA balance sheet at risk and do all these overlay swaps only in sectors or clients that particularly achieve a particular development or climate agenda, and ideally our own client where we've had some skin in the game. Now, to extend that, I think the ideal situation to extend that is to have a hedging facility where it need not be an IFC or a multilateral client, which can be tapped as a swap counterparty. And that's at a very design phase. We've been having some discussion. As recent as last week, I met with some representatives of the US government also, where they're thinking, how can they systematically help on the local currency side? And one of the ideas being mooted with some of the governments, including NGCF, can play a role, and the donors, is to have a blended finance facility, a large hedging facility, which can have, and I don't want to get into technical details, which can have collars and caps on the exchange rate deviation so that your pricing risk is pretty much well defined and manageable over a 20-year period. And if it goes out of whack, then concessional finance can come in and take some risk sharing. It's still at the design phases. We would love to get pick brains of experts like you. How do we design it? What is the minimum amount of concessionality and all that? But when we design that, whichever donor we talk to, ultimately they are looking at this as a stopgap arrangement. They're saying, we will give our donor funding, but it should not be a leaking bucket. Ultimately, we want a road to sustainability for capital markets in order to do that. So these are some early, I'm giving you some headline views on this. Thanks.
This is really developments are happening. TCX is there, and an institute like IFC, if they act as a counterparty and directly deal with RBI, that can surely reduce the cost of hedging. This is, I think, it will be a great product. And as you rightly said, it cannot be a leaking bucket. At some time, you need an institution which enjoys a natural hedge, and that is the only when the capital market will really develop for currency hedging. Thank you so much for this. So finally, again, coming to Manikkan. So, practically you are funding the projects, and for funding the projects, it is not just debt, it is equity as well. So how do you optimize this cost of capital on debt, equity, and so on and so forth, mesh debt?
Yeah, so thanks. So there are, like, as I said earlier, for our business, there are two elements, like debt and equity for every infra business. So to optimize the cost of debt, So one way is at the construction financing stage, we may take a slightly expensive debt because it's available quick and because we want to deliver the project to the customer. But then that construction finance is taken out to project finance pretty quickly within a period of 4 to 6 months. And that financing can either come from a NBFC or comes from a bank, depending on the timeline it takes to close the financial close of the project. But what we always believe that is within a year or 2 years, this debt can be refinanced in the market when the project has operating track record, has got operating cash flows, which is visible to the banks and lenders. And that becomes an easy way, like we have done recently a financing with an IFL, where we refinanced a couple of our projects for putting it together. And we got final rates. So the idea is to improve the cost of financing, and the cost of financing improves when you reduce the risk, which is when you move from a construction stage to a operating stage, and with a history, then it changes. Obviously, there's an opportunity to do a green bond, which we are exploring. We continue to explore. It's a question of the size and the pool of capital that we need to raise, and what is the history of the projects that we have that we can show. Since we are a very young organization, our history is limited to the last 2-3 years. So we are putting in pools of assets that will have at least a 1 year operating history. So we look at that as a way of doing it. I mean, we will consider at the appropriate time an international bond issuance as well, when we have enough size to sort of raise that sort of pool, because the international markets require you to have at least a certain size of capital. But that's not an immediate priority right now. So these are areas how we can reduce the cost of debt. A couple of other ideas, which I don't know, I mean, since we have a lot of other players in the segment, we think that we should have a separate dedicated line, like you have for rooftop. We should have a line for the C&I segment for open access projects. Now, I think the regulations is pretty much fairly understood. There have been a lot of movement on the regulatory front. We have seen green open access rules, green energy open access rules that have come out. They're getting played out now in the market. And I think a lot of institutions earlier had apprehensions that the open access approvals will not be available for long term. But I think we have, and in fact, we know banks, including you, have held back some financing at the end tail because they want to see that short-term open access agreement being converted to long-term, especially in Maharashtra. And that has happened. I mean, we have projects which are operating. It happens just the paperwork time. The way it's designed, it takes you 6 months anyway, no matter what you do. So that's how it is done. So maybe there is an opportunity for us to work with the regulators to see how that can be reduced. So that's an area we can do. But like for example, priority sector lending. I mean, right now it's capped at 30 crores. I mean, that is only useful for a project of 5 to 8 megawatts. Now, if that limit was increased to say 200 crores, there's an opportunity to do a lot more projects in the CRI market, and the banks and institutions will be able to, not sort of hit that limit. What they have. So that there is an opportunity for us to reduce the cost of debt at the ab initio stage itself. That's one opportunity. Second is obviously the leverage part, which obviously plays a game. So normally everybody's doing 70-30, right? And we think that the assets that we are building today, while everybody is looking at a 25-year life cycle, the modules that we are buying today are actually can be run for 30 years. And most of the land and other things that we signed up either owned or leased, and they have a 30-year life. So technically, there is a lot of cash flow that will be left post the financing period. But the market by nature, the banking market by nature is not a long-term market. They would allow to limit it to 12, 15 years or 18 years at best. Even we have a 25-year contract with no exit for the customer. Even on a contract that they would maybe push it to 18 to 20 years. So maybe those projects are like worth for a bond financing. But I think there is an opportunity to extend the tenure of the financing. And because there is residual cash flow available, you can structure the cash out in such a way that there is enough tail left and still can be financed. But unfortunately, what's happening is that because the counterparty is a private sector counterparty, and people think that this PPA is only for a lock-in of 15 years. What happens after 15? And then some of the banks and some of the institutions like IRDA are now willing to take a call that if the life of the project is 25 years, we're willing to give up to 18 years or 20 years, even though the lock-ins are 15 years. because they believe that the tail left is very small and there is enough in the market. Even if you do it at discounted price at that point in time, you still have enough cash flows to pay off the debt. So there are views taken like that. And I think I would encourage more institutions to start thinking on those lines. And I think the point is very clear. I mean, I'll give an example today. We are talking to a customer, we're doing a large project for them. It's an islanded project, islanded company with completely on thermal plant, wanting to transition to renewables because there are supply chain pressures from globally with the export products. They want them to transition into a green journey. And we are trying to integrate a sort of a large renewable project into their, it's a direct transmission line system into their LT panel. And without them having to sort of go through the open access route. So there are combinations. Now there is an issue about how do you ramp up and ramp down the turbines and you put controlling systems in place. So there are ways of doing these kind of projects. And thereby I see that, these opportunities here are so huge that if the banks and institutions play a role in working on transitioning solutions for corporates, the market is huge. So, we look at it from cost of debt, leverage, because that ratio changes everything. And then from coming to cost of equity. Now, equity investors in infra, are not like looking for the moon. They are happy with the 14-15% on the project level. But even to get that for the risk that we are taking, it's not easy. Market is very competitive. So over a longer term, tenure, we believe that InvITs will be the way to get the equity out for the developers like us. And the faster we do that and recycle the capital, we have a better way to put them in more developmental projects. Now there, the issue has been that most of the InvITs, if you go to a listed InvIT, then you have other challenges with SEBI. So most of them are unlisted, and that pool of capital for InvITs is limited. So we think that if SEBI comes out with a more sort of clearer definitions about sector-wise matrices for renewables can be different from that is proposed. So you can have higher leverage which currently is around 70%. Maybe the operational phase after some point you can even support a 75%, 80%. If they allow that, then there will be more participation in listed InvITs, and that is also a big opportunity. Because the unlisted InvIT capital pool is still limited. So these are some ideas we are working on. I think the market's also developing as we speak. So it'll be good to.
Thanks, Mani. Number of things are being done. InvITs, then you spoke about the cost of debt itself, construction stage, two-stage financing, tenor of the loans. So all these are quite creative and innovative, and I'm sure the market will develop.
Point I missed out, which I want to add, is that the market. When I talk to my counterparties at Lightsource BP, because they sit on the investment committee and we have conversations with them. And I was talking to the people in the UK. I said, in India, we always want a long-term PPA, 15, 20, 25 years. Otherwise, there's no financing available. So how do you guys do it in the CNI market in the UK and other places? They said that all our PPAs have a 1-year walk-away clause. People can walk out after 1 year, and there's no compulsion on them. Obviously, if you put that into Indian context, the market's huge. There are a lot of people, corporates, either because they don't want to have that kind of long-term contractual position in the books, and second is they have to go to the board for such long-term contracts, and third is that they have an issue because if you take a 25-year project, then the accounting of that project PPA gets classified as it's like a lease model, and then it shows up in the books from an auditor perspective. So a lot of MNCs don't want to do that, so they will still want a 5-year clause of break or 10-year clause, but it doesn't help the banking market because they don't see it that way. So I was talking to them and saying, how do you guys do it then? So obviously, I think the one area which can be improved is now we have a huge pool of assets coming in India. If we develop the electricity market, right now we are talking about virtual PPA products and stuff like that. So if that market develops, the exchange products are coming out well, and if that market develops further and further, then we should have independent pricing models for each state where independent agencies can give the tariff model for the pricing expectation over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And this is what happens in Australia. They also take the pricing model and say, hey, you know what? This is the pricing model. The bankers are okay with taking that pricing model and saying, this is what we apply on the cash flows. So even if the contract is not long-term, we know that there will be a price for this power at this point in time. And based on that, they do their analysis. Unlike in our case, we see, because infrastructure is capital upfront, We don't see that in other projects, right? For example, you lend to a project that is putting up a manufacturing. You don't have any guarantee on the tariff for the next, or the price of the good for the next 25 years. But people do finance it because there is a market study. So that market study is really an area where there is an opportunity to transit the Indian market from a long-term PPA tenure to a short-term, where the finances are willing to do that. Yeah, sure. Please.
So very quickly, I think on the capital markets discussion that we had earlier, another solution interim that we have been working on, and IFC has issued local currency bonds as a source of funding in at least 10 currencies worldwide, including India, where we have done our Maharaja bond and Masala bond and all, where because of IFC's rating and all that, we issue a rupee bond, but international investors tap into it and are willing to take exchange risk. I think sophisticated countries like India should encourage more and more of that. They gave us special permission to do it when there was a crisis a few years ago. And in fact, they approached us, come and raise rupees in India to local bond. But that could be also one way of allowing foreign entities to raise local currency in the home country, whether offshore or onshore. Yes. And park it in G6 or whatever it is at least India can do it, I think, in some calibrated manner. Not give permission left, right, and center, but at least for a finite thing. And that's a discussion worth having with the central bank.
Yes. I fully agree. Foreign exchange, why should the domestic borrowers take it? Let it go to the international market, which is what it is. Shalabh, thank you so much. Shalabh has prior engagement, so he has to leave now. But thanks for the very value-added discussion. Thank you, Shalabh. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I would like to invite some questions from the audience. Probably we can have 2 or 3 questions. Yeah. Already 4 hands are up. So maybe you can start. You raise your hand first. Yeah. Yeah.
Without which we somewhat cannot achieve the net zero emission.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Yeah, my question is around all the hue and cry about the 100 billion that the North promised on loss and damage and hasn't materialized. And I think there's a big trust issue there. I'm not underestimating its importance. But I'm wondering in that context why your adaptation drawdown has been so low. If this funding channel is available and we are making a hue and cry that more money needs to come, then why are we not tapping it? What's the bottleneck? Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the question. I think I will start with the loss and damage financing. And if you remember, last year, October, in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, there was a long discussion about loss and damage, and it's still ongoing. And at the GCF, what we do is the GCF is financing or is responding to the COP decisions. If the COP provided guidance to start to perform or to establish a given area or a given policy, then the GCF start to do that. But in a way, go back since the loss and damage starts. We had about Glasgow, COP26. We had that in Madrid as well. A long discussion and a lot of tension, pushback from different countries and different economies. We have developed, we have developing. So everyone has a different argument against it, and who will financing the loss and damage, and what are the structures in place in order to properly assess and are financing that. So in those all of those works are still ongoing, but unfortunately GCF has not started. And now maybe we need to wait for the good news in COP28. Maybe the GCF will get that mandate to start officially financing loss on damage. But it's still the discussion that the GCF is taking and looking forward to that. And financing gap for adaptation. Yeah, that's a really good question and hard one that we had even in our evaluation. And we ask ourselves why still there is a missing or there's like a missing pieces here for adaptation. And what we come up with is we look at the adaptation and we found out that adaptation are very, very complex. And even understanding what is adaptation, we had this 2021 provided the pandemic issues, but we managed to speak with different countries to understand from their perspectives what they understand by adaptation. But most of countries, they couldn't differentiate between development and adaptation. So there are a lot of work, there are a lot of intervention that are going under development, but for the countries, they don't understand whether it is adaptation or is development. So that difficulty is to understand, and I can just put in as a framework as well, just to properly assess and to put what is adaptation and what is development, what are the requirements that are still debatable a lot, but also complexity overall. And we see that adaptation projects or intervention, most of them are not bankable, and return of investment is really, really low and it's very, very long term, and also it's high risk, I can say. And a lot of them are local into local context. So if you sum up all these complexities, as well as like bankabilities, as well as a return of investments that is like not really realized, and this there is also perceived risks. It's not like a clear risk, real risk, but it's perceived. Maybe this is not really useful, or like from the supply side. So the demand side is very clear, but the supply side is yet to be realized and put it clear. So those are the issues that cause that gap still going to within for adaptation.
So as I understand, understandably, there has been a lot of focus on the renewable energy, power, energy, and mobility sector. However, given that India is focusing currently on decarbonizing agriculture, which in itself is a very high risk sector, is there any mechanism being developed, or are there any thoughts on how scalability and viability will be achieved in agricultural decarbonization projects?
My limited exposure to agriculture decarbonization has been on probably a couple of sides. One is that typically because in many states in India, power is free for farmers. So there's no incentive for the pump sets which they are using to be energy efficient. I mean, that's the lowest hanging fruit. So, and some states and certain, policies have supported migrating farmers to solar pump sets, which they can very easily set up in their own fields. So they will not require any of the fossil fuel to run their, power requirements, whether it is for water pump or it is for electricity. So again, the capital expenditure there, and it's all about incentive. If you are getting something without paying, you are unlikely to invest, even if the cost benefit is there and there is a payback for that. So I think the broader answer to that has to happen not just in agriculture, it has to happen everywhere. Just like India has done away with LPG subsidy and it is being now provided to people who deserve it directly into their bank account, and all of us don't get that anymore. So maybe, electricity has to be done the same way, where people who government wishes to subsidized, they get it paid, but everybody pays for the electricity the same way. Those who cannot, get that subsidy, either as electricity units free into their account, and you have smart meters and lots of projects are happening. So I think, we will have to, put a cost to it first, and then it will succeed, is my limited view. I think.
Actually, agriculture is complex in India because the land holdings are small. At the same time, if you see the real emission that happens from, say, paddy cultivation, that happens from the cattle, that happens from the way we use urea. So, because agriculture is something which is not corporatized, it's going to be a different kind of challenge. But within the told some practical points which can be done and done very fast. Yeah, probably in India, you will see more activity on the industrial front, on the mobility, on power, and eventually we'll have something in agriculture.
And then we'll wrap up the session.
That will be. So you want to take this?
Yeah, thanks. I'll take it. So I think your first question was about the various sources of renewable energy. So I think while solar has been on the forefront in the last few years, and that's primarily happened because of its ability to achieve grid parity and show economic savings. So that's the reason why solar is leading that front. Having said that, I don't think we as a business are married to any particular technology. We believe that the technology that can deliver value as an affordability to the customer is what should be played along with. And so that's first on solar. But I think if you look at wind has also in the last few years come up again on the curve, because it's also now with the wind turbine heights going up, the hub heights are increasing with the newer models of turbine with a larger rotor diameter. India is still a very low wind regime country. I mean, not, and the best of the wind sites have been taken away in the olden days when we were using the smaller capacity turbines. So that has shifted now to looking at, for a low wind regime, can we do the higher hub heights and the sort of a larger rotor turbines. So we are looking at some wind options as well. I think the market is transiting from a pure solar, the way we look at it is to solar to hybrid. And hybrid can be in multiple forms. Hybrid can be in the form of solar plus wind, could be co-located, could be not co-located, could be bundled through the grid system. And so that you still settle on a 15-minute slot basis. So that's one. The third is you could bundle it along with energy storage, like battery energy storage could be one solution, but the battery energy storage bids are now coming out from a energy storage as a service in itself. So which are directly on the grid. So what we do is when we wheel power, we are actually using the grid as a bank. It costs the discom. Obviously, they charge wheeling charges, banking charges. But if there is a service available separately, say energy storage service, which is priced in the market, and these are services that are there around the world. You can have frequency related services, you can have harmonics related services, they're called ancillary services products that are there everywhere. That market needs to develop in India. But yes, the movement is towards looking for more hybrid, because at some point the discom is going to say, I don't need all the power in the day, I need the power in the night. Solar can't produce power in the night. So we need to bundle it with wind. Other option is we are also looking at, and then the government is now come out with draft on pump storage project, PSP, right? So when you have pump storage hydro projects, that becomes an interesting case, because then that competes with wind ultimately, because you need wind in the day. You can have wind which is seasonal and can be at different points of the day and of the year. Solar, which complements with wind in the rainy season, but has a very different profile of wind generation. I mean, so solar generation and wind generation complementarity. But if you add either a battery storage to it, or you add a pump storage hydro to it, it changes the profile very well, and you can slowly move towards a real-time RTC, what you call round the clock. We're not there yet, but I think the market is moving towards that round the clock. And round the clock today definition is like 80%. If you're there, you're done round the clock. You're not at 100% round the clock. And the battery technologies are still very expensive. Even the current bids that happened, the pricing is around 5.5 rupees a unit. And it's not a generating, right? It's not generating, just storing and discharging. So it's not adding any value in terms of new units, but it is helping you do peak shifting. It helps you to save on arbitrage on the tariff between peak and non-peak time. So those are good technology working. Coming back to geothermal or India that doesn't have much geothermal opportunities. If you look at other opportunities like you talked about tidal wave, these are all at a very early stage. The yields are pretty low. People have looked at BIPP films on the buildings, right? But their yields are pretty low. So you can look at all these kind of different technologies. But at the end of the day, the technology that will deliver value to the customer, India as a market is a very, very price conscious market. I don't think this market would have developed with this kind of 150 gigawatt if the tariff pricing was at 7 or 8 rupees. It has developed because we are operating at a 2.5, 3 rupee sort of price market. And ultimately, all these technologies will have to compete on a commercial basis to deliver value to the customer. And there will be different other solutions like wind and other things, which will add on to the solar as a mainstay technology, but will have to find its own place in terms of adding to the commercial value to the customer. That's how I see this evolve.
Okay. We'll take one final question from sir here.
Yeah. So I'm Rohit Kumar. I'm Secretary General for Carbon Market Association of India. So my question is about carbon finance. So we're discussing about the financing for achieving net zero goal and for India. So carbon market is growing very fast. So by 2030, we are expecting that $600 to $700 billion market will be there globally. And India is leader in voluntary carbon market with 30% share right now. So which are the area where GCF is working right now and helping Indian carbon market? And also in terms of community empowerment has to play a very important role, as our Honorable Prime Minister talked about LIFE campaign. And it is accelerating not only India, but also global market. And we have target around reaching 5 million households around the world. So we'd like to ask from GCF that which are the area where GCF is empowering Indian carbon market, financing the projects, which is really impacting the life of the people. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So far for now, the GCF doesn't have the complete mandate on the carbon pricing. Still, the discussions and to see what are the clear structures to be in place. Do we have the same maybe definitions? Do we have across the countries, across the sectors that we talk about the green carbon tagging or so something like that? But we do have result-based payments where the GCF is financing. We're seeing that a lot of projects in Latin American, Caribbean, have Brazil, have Chile, that have already benefited from result-based payments, and also as well as RED Plus. So these initiatives GCF is supporting a lot, and maybe looking forward, we might the GCF might consider looking at the carbon pricing, but structure need to be in place before jumping into that.
So are you doing some clean cooking initiative also in India, supporting clean cooking initiative?
So in nutshell, if I look at the overall India portfolio of the GCF, low emission transport is a leading portfolio for India that's GCF is supporting, as well as renewable energy. But if you go to other, I mean, like cooking stoves and other, that could be maybe intervention below, that's a different type of energy, right? So it should be under renewable energy result areas. But we have other areas that India is not doing well. I mean, like it just lagging a little bit behind frontiers and other countries that take over. But in terms of low emission transport and renewable energy, India is doing very, very good compared to other countries.
I think the thing is that with finance, the questions are never ending. So sadly, we will have to end this session. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Manikkan, Mr. Chourasia, Mr. Pankaj, Mr. Peter, and Mr. Tandon, who just left. I would like to thank our partners, Starter Clean Tech, and Mr. Jain, who's right there. Thank you for all your support. We have the lunch coupons outside. You can collect it. And the great part about this session is, since TERI is also part of, as a knowledge partner for the G20, the discussion doesn't end here. It'll go to the national policy discourse, and we'll take these insights there. And most certainly, we can make something going forward. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful having you here. Thank you, everyone.